Imagine an economy that's climate-friendly, socially fair, and makes good economic sense all at the same time. That's what we are diving in today, and we've got two great guests with us. Betony Jones, who worked with President Joe Biden on boosting the green economy through active industrial policy while making sure good jobs come with it, and Sebastian Dullien and his team at the EMK, who show how green growth and social justice can actually go hand in hand. Together, they will look at where the US and where Germany stand in this big social ecological transformation. What are the risks for climate and for social cohesion, and how can policy advice help shape a fair and sustainable future? Welcome, Betony Jones and Sebastian Dullien. Welcome here on stage.
So, welcome. Thank you to the organizers for setting up this lunch talk here. Thanks to Betony to being here with us. You've been here for a week now in Düsseldorf and Berlin. Before we start, I would like to briefly discuss why we are here. I mean, I was just introduced as the director of the IMK, but you are here because you have a very specific expertise of bringing together decarbonization and good jobs. And maybe you say a few words of what you have been doing the past years.
Yes, so I've really spent my career at the intersection of labor and climate policy, really helping organized labor in the US see a future for themselves in a low-carbon economy, which takes nuanced analysis because the clean energy transition does lead to some existential threats to working people if policy intervention doesn't make sure that working people are protected. So helping the labor unions see how they can influence policy decisions in order to lead to the kinds of climate policies that fundamentally help working families in the United States. So I've toggled between policy research and implementation. And as Sebastian said, for the last 4 years until January, I was working in the Biden administration, charged with implementing a good jobs agenda in the energy sector, which was a really incredible opportunity because, one, I've been studying this for so long, and two, we had historic investments in infrastructure and aligned with an industrial policy that was really oriented around climate change, which was a huge departure from the past and something that I think actually caught a lot of us by surprise. So having that experience implementing good labor standards in the IRA and other policies associated with this industrial policy is something that I've been here in Germany and working with the Hans Böckler Foundation to identify what did we learn, where did we go wrong, and where can we go in the future.
Let's maybe start here. We already talked last week. We had a very nice dinner on Friday, going into a lot of these issues. And what you said there is that, well, basically the game changer in the US was when you managed to get the talk about decarbonization away from risks towards opportunities. Yeah, so basically you chose the carrot instead of the stick, and well, you at least you hoped, and I mean there was the shift. You had the majorities in Congress to pass all that legislation, and you hoped to get a broader movement going. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit, because from a German perspective, that is really interesting. If I look at what we are discussing here, there are a lot of economists and also some politicians who say the carbon price needs not only to be the key instrument, but basically the only instrument to get to decarbonize the economy. And of course, that's a big stick. We all know that if we come from the manufacturing sector, but maybe elaborate a little bit what the carrots were and how the discussion was framed there.
Yeah, so the climate movement in the US has also tried for many years to put a price on carbon, and some states have managed to do that and have developed carbon markets. But politically, we could never get those policies across the finish line. And this is because I think there's not a broad enough coalition that is inspired just by GHG emission reductions and these kind of technical economic approaches to putting a price on carbon and letting the free market figure out how all of that is going to happen. So what I saw early in the 2000s working on climate policy was that unless we stopped talking about climate action in terms of sacrifice and started talking about it in terms of opportunity for good quality jobs and investment opportunities and business opportunities for communities and working people, that we would really never get the political consensus that we needed. So after many, many failed efforts to put a price on carbon, and this policy that the Biden administration really adopted brought together the idea that we could reduce greenhouse gases by investing in our infrastructure and onshoring those supply chains for clean energy, putting the US in a position of relevance in this projected $23 trillion clean energy economy, and addressing social equity, and ensuring that the benefits of these investments would flow to workers and through good quality jobs and to disadvantaged communities. So that bringing those issues together finally got us a suite of really ambitious climate policies, really more significant in terms of emission reductions than anything we had ever seen. With full implementation of the IRA, emissions were projected to decrease 40%, bringing us within striking range of our Paris Agreement goals.
So a lot of the audience might have heard about the IRA or the Inflation Reduction Act. Maybe you can just point out what were some of the main instruments here. I mean, what exactly did this act do? I mean, it was a huge bill, but I think many might not know what exactly you're talking about.
Well, you said it earlier. The U.S. adopts policy through carrots, just carrots upon carrots upon carrots. It's a very incentive-based approach to engaging private sector participation. And so the Inflation Reduction Act was based on these incentives. And it was really the primary function, although the Inflation Reduction Act did a lot of things in terms of prescription drugs and closing corporate tax loopholes. But on the clean energy side, the main thing was that it provided really uncapped tax credits for all sorts of clean energy investments, from wind and solar and geothermal and other forms of clean energy, clean electricity production, to manufacturing and supply chain investments. And so these tax credits there was a base tax credit, but then there was a huge enhanced tax credit for firms that met certain labor conditions. There was a wage standard and a training standard for the construction industry. And then there were yet additional incentives if investments went to designated communities. So these are transitioning energy communities or other low-income communities. And so these layered tax credits were incredibly generous, that while they weren't regulations, firms mostly treated them as regulations and thought about them in terms of compliance and how could they meet these standards to not leave money on the table. In some cases, those tax credits added up to 70% of the cost of a project, which was incidentally much more generous than the subsidy program that we had through grants and loans, where firms were expected to contribute a much higher percent. So this was not direct spending, it was foregone future revenue, because the tax credits are retroactive. Firms do the work and then apply for the tax credit, or they don't apply, they claim the tax credit in their taxes, and so they're not paying the taxes, and the US government isn't collecting the revenue that it otherwise would have. The rationale, of course, being that these tax credits are growing the economy and growing the pie overall, that we're not really missing out on any future revenue.
I would like to follow up on this a little bit. You say uncapped tax credits. That can get very expensive. And I mean, especially here in Germany, we always say, well, there isn't money for A, there isn't money for B. And you might have heard we used to have a very strict constitutional debt brake. This has now been softened for defense spending, or basically completely abolished for defense spending. But, well, there's still a cap on investment spending. How was the discussion in the US? I mean, did you just say, well, this is so important, we need to do this investment now and it will pay for later? Or did someone say, well, we cannot afford this, we rather continue the path we have?
Well, certainly. There was zero bipartisan support. So the Senate had 50 votes on the Democrat side and 50 votes opposing this policy, and the tiebreaker was our Vice President, Kamala Harris. So many people thought that it would be too expensive, and then the other side thought that it was worth the cost. There were budget estimates of what it would ultimately cost, so there was a sense of that. But again, we were trying to grow the economy and bring back industries that we had long since lost, or where we really didn't have any market share or any competitive advantage. So critical minerals were a huge focus. Battery manufacturing was a huge focus. In general, we had strong domestic content criteria in these laws. It was another priority of the Biden administration to support the domestic supply chains through Made in America criteria. So all of that was intended to kind of grow jobs and grow the economy and make up for the costs.
You mentioned the domestic content requirements. I mean, that is something we're discussing here at the moment as well, especially if we see the competition in e-mobility from China, and we don't have the battery production here. And the question is, how can we get that going? Maybe you can elaborate a little bit where you had the local content and, well, domestic content, you would say, because, well, it's not local in the US, and what your experience was with that.
Yeah, so this was quite complicated, but also something that needed to be pursued from multiple angles. So a demand requirement saying X% of the material in this vehicle charger has to be domestically sourced. That had to go along with supply support. So that was where our grants and our loans came in. We used the Defense Production Act to jumpstart and sort of require manufacturing of certain components like heat pumps. So there was a connection to both government procurement and the support that provides in terms of certainty for production, the domestic content lever, which provides certainty to stimulate investment, and then support through the tax credits and the grants and the loans to support the growth of those supply chain industries. So it's not, I think the domestic content criteria alone would be maybe not, would be very difficult, especially when you're dealing with supply chains where you don't have any existing capacity. We had to support the development of that capacity at the same time that we were demanding it. I think the important thing that is maybe relevant for the German context is that we started with a strong signal. So for example, for our electric vehicle incentives, there was a domestic content and domestic assembly requirement that the first year there wasn't a single vehicle that qualified, but that wasn't a failure. We knew that was likely to be the case because there hadn't been an opportunity to build that supply chain yet. So then the second year, while the domestic content criteria ratcheted up each year, the supply chain was more intact and there was more vehicles met it. And that was the theory of the case, that each year more vehicles would meet that threshold, but you can't lower the threshold or change the target because then you never get the strong enough signal to stimulate the investment.
I think that there's an important lesson here for Germany. Whenever we brought up domestic content requirements in the past, an argument was that this is against the rules of the World Trade Organization, against WTO rules, and because we are so dependent on our exports, we don't want to mess with that.
Yeah.
Now we find ourselves in a world where the US doesn't care, China doesn't necessarily care, so maybe we need definitely rethink here. And what you explained is very interesting, how you can use those rules to build up domestic supply chains. So I think there really might be a lesson here for us. Well, let me come to politics here. Actually, I mean, you described so well that you used the carrots, and the idea was to get the people on board. And yet, if I look at your last election, it wasn't necessarily very successful, at least not in electoral terms. In Germany, we have, I think, a bit of a different story because we didn't use the carrot so much. We used the carbon pricing, and the problem here is now that, I mean, if you look at energy prices, the largest increase has come from the energy price shock from the Russian invasion in Ukraine. So this is roughly 3/4 of the energy price increase. But if you talk to the workers or the management in the companies, sometimes the perception is this all has been decarbonization. So if jobs are lost, they say, well, look, you have increased the carbon price, now we have to close down the factories, and they don't see what else has been going on. So in your view, what has gone wrong in communicating this idea? And let's start with the United States, because I mean, you targeted exactly some of the so-called red states where the Republicans had a majority. They received a lot of, I think they received the largest share of the IRA subsidies, in fact, and still they voted against that in the end, and now it's being dismantled. So where did you get that wrong? What happened here?
What's interesting about being in Germany is more people know about the IRA here than at home. Really, nobody knows about it unless you work in this field or you've been tracking climate policy. Nobody has heard of it, and even very, very well-informed people. And so there were a couple of problems. I mean, one, that was a problem, and I think in part it was because of the President Biden's comprehensive agenda. The IRA was actually negotiated behind closed doors. And again, we were trying to get to that 50-vote threshold. We did not pass the IRA through the traditional legislative process. We got it through budget reconciliation, which has different procedural rules and isn't as robust as legislation passed the normal way. So there wasn't a huge push from civil society or a great sense of ownership around this bill. And that's, I think, part of what was initially challenging about selling it. But then also, we did not do it, unlike President Trump, who sends people checks with his signature and puts his face on the Department of Labor as, you know, I'm fighting for workers. We didn't use those kinds of theatrics at all. In fact, we forgot to put signs up for projects that were funded by these bills. So there was no attribution, even though workers had all the work they could do plus overtime. Everybody in the construction industry was working. Unemployment was low. Communities, like on average, there were 30 new large factory investments in every state. There were over 3,000 across the country with new announcements every day. This means every community was benefiting from these investments, but there was no attribution back to the policy or President Biden's agenda. I think for the most part at these ribbon cuttings, the Republicans who didn't vote for the bill would show up, and claim credit. The CEOs of the companies would show up and claim credit, and nobody was really communicating that all of this was part of a broader and really intentional package. That was a huge failure. But by every measure, the programs were working. We were crowding in investment. That means private investment was not replacing public investment, but added to it. We were getting investments in all 50 states. We were on track with these emission reductions. Job quality was increasing. Unionization rates in the energy sector increased 2 years in a row. So all of the trends were in the right direction, but none of that was enough to overcome other political vulnerabilities for the president. That's just a huge and painful lesson.
Wow. Would you say it was rather the lack of communication or the deficit in communication, or did you just not have enough time? I mean, would that have been differently or played out differently if the election had been in 2026 instead of 2024?
Everybody you talk to has different ideas of what went wrong. A lot of us who were really bought into this working think we didn't have enough time. We had 2 years from when the Inflation Reduction Act passed and the election, and 3 years for the infrastructure spending. At my agency, we're responsible for the clean energy part of these investments. We obligated 99% of the money. We got it all out. So we moved in record time. That's really challenging to do with $100 billion in grants and $400 billion in loans. It's a lot of oversight and planning. So we moved in record time, but we didn't have enough time. There was lots of factories under construction, but none of them were operating yet. The manufacturing jobs hadn't returned. We're still losing manufacturing jobs in the US. And these policies require sort of continuous care and feeding. A one-time influx of money isn't enough to totally rebuild your industrial sector. So we really needed the 4 more years to make sure that it worked. But we also, even if we had 4 more years, we needed a better plan for communicating that. Maybe it helps when you have a president who's out there all the time and selling the agenda. I think President Biden was sadly sort of old and didn't have that energy to push it as much as we needed.
I think there's an important lesson here for Germany. You might have heard, or you said you have been discussing the 500 billion extra investment fund we are having now. And when you talk about these experiences, I'm really afraid that, because I mean this investment fund has been something the unions have been lobbying for, advocating for. Maybe not exactly in that setup, but what we have claimed for a long time is that you need to bring forward more credit-financed investment, both in infrastructure and climate protection. But I mean, the problem, what you describe, is also if just money is spent and no one sees the positive effects from it, it will be very difficult to win back voters. And some people might be disillusioned because there's so much money spent. And we're now having a very poisonous public debate whether the money is misappropriated, used for things it should not be used for in the budget. I mean, maybe not for expensive dinners or parties, but nevertheless for increases in pensions or tax cuts which are not at all related to any incentives here. So I think it is very important here that first we get that communicated, and second we get to see the effects very quickly. One discussion we are having here in Germany is that it takes a long time to get something. I mean, if you want to build a factory, it takes a long time to get through all the processes, get all the permits and so on. How is that in the United States? Can you just start building, or has that been a problem for the IRA as well?
Yeah, in some states, yeah, you can literally start building. In Nevada, there's an industrial park. This is where Tesla and Panasonic gigafactories are, and a lot of new battery investments. And what companies had told me is they would show up to look at the site and be handed the permits that day to start building. In California, where I lived, that is not the case at all. So I think a lot of these investments did flow to states with lower regulatory hurdles to commence construction. And we really, with the IRA, it really was a race because there was a 10-year cap. So the sooner that factories could get up and running and making batteries, the better off they would be, the more they would be able to tap into those incentives. So yeah, the low wages in certain states and the low regulatory barrier did help attract certain investments, but there were also a lot of investments going to states, blue states, the democratic states, still got 30 or 35, 40% of the investments. So companies sort of have different business models, and I think the democratic states were really trying to compete on a higher skilled workforce, more advanced manufacturing, R&D. Certainly, there's certain competitive advantages of the states with more regulation and higher wages that we're still sort of experimenting with how to leverage those as strengths in this industrial transformation.
We have only like 3 minutes left, so let me come to an end and try to get an outlook here. Well, the US moved from being climate villain to role model during the Biden administration, if I may say it that way, for a short period, yes, and gave inspiration also to unions on this side of the Atlantic. We went with a delegation to the US to look into the IRA 2 years ago. So now, then now you're off track, basically. I mean, now you pulled out of the Paris Agreement. It looks pretty awful, and of course that has consequences for us as well. Last week, when the leading German Economic Research Institute published their forecast, they said, well, German decarbonization efforts should be conditioned on what the rest of the world is doing. Yeah, so I mean, that is really a pretty tough statement, because it takes away a lot of what we thought is essential for climate policies. And well, we also see a backlash in terms of regulation, good labor, good work, and so on. So my question is, can you build a positive scenario? What is that going downhill in the US from here on, or can you envision a scenario where you get back on track?
I think there's more possible scenarios now than there were a year ago. In the Biden administration, we were trying to support this race to the top, sort of collaborative competition where we trade with other countries that have high standards environmentally and in terms of labor policy, and sort of, create an interdependence to accelerate decarbonization. Maybe we can still get back on track with that, not in the immediate term, but hopefully over the longer term. I think there's in terms of global cooperation, there's other possible scenarios that each country just tries to do it alone, and certainly Trump's trade, I don't want to call it a strategy, but his antics with the tariffs they're actually hurting our clean energy deployment goals, which is probably by design, and hurting global cooperation. And if every country does that, then we'll sort of see what happens. I think it will probably slow our climate progress. Then I guess there's the opportunity that China models a way forward, and there's sort of a new world order in the future. So I think there's so many different directions this can go. But on the upside, in the US, I think there's still a lot of momentum at the state level and local level. There's still a lot of labor leadership to support climate policy at the state and local level, and still a lot of interest in pursuing those local solutions. And so that's where we can experiment, where we can build models and continue to build that broad support for when there are future opportunities.
Okay, so that's a very positive note. It's great to end this conversation here. So, well, and I hope you're right, and I hope this will materialize that way. Thank you, Betony, for being here. Thanks for making all the long way from California, where you are based at the moment. Thank you to all of you for coming here and listening. Thank you very much.